You know, as a film critic, I keep up with a lot of entertainment news. I like to stay in touch with topics that are currently relevant in the film and media space, and this can often influence the types of coverage I pursue in my work. This has often yielded some incredible pieces in the past, where I love delving into the stories of smaller and more independently focused projects that later find multitudes of success among audiences. And this is perhaps why my interest was first piqued when I came across the shocking news that Fathom Entertainment was going to release the final episode of the Amazing Digital Circus in theaters. Now, to put it into context, I have never watched a single episode of this show, but as someone involved in social media and the film space specifically, I have no doubt felt the impact of this show over the last several months. In the animation realm specifically, it's a show that I know has had a lot of attention drawn to it by a passionate fan base around the world, no doubt due to its artistic quality from the small crew behind the projects and the whimsical storytelling on display. However, outside of this context, nothing about the show itself had ever drawn me in specifically, as I had never taken the chance to look further into its intricacies or depth. However, when I first saw the news about the finale's success at landing a theatrical release, which is unheard of in this day and age at the box office landscape, my perception of the series ultimately changed. I will always be there day one to support indie projects that manage to cut a deep impact on the overcrowded box office landscape, and the fact that a smaller and more independent focused project has managed to not only take the animation world by storm, but actually landed a release on one of the most crowded weekends of the summer, that's absolutely awesome. And for this reason, I made the decision that, because of its release, I would take it upon myself to check out and cover the finale in theaters. However, I also realized that I couldn't just walk into that final episode blind. I needed to watch the rest of the show first to gain the context required to see how the show shapes up in the end. And so, if you've clicked on this video and you're watching this, you'll no doubt know what I will be doing, which is that today I will be binge watching the entirety of the Amazing Digital Circus for the first time in order to prepare for the finale. This is an experience I am both excited yet hesitant for, as on the one hand, I'm really eager to see what all the buzz and conversation surrounding this one is for, as I've heard nothing but blatant praise for it in animation circles worldwide. Yet on the other hand, a part of me worries about the effect of this unanimous hype on the show, and whether my expectations will be placed too high on what the show delivers versus what I expect personally. However, nonetheless, I'm eager to see how my opinion on the show itself shapes over the entire experience. An important element to discern here is I know literally nothing about the show whatsoever. I purposefully did not look up anything plot related ahead of time, and I have not watched a single second of marketing materials or trailers for this show. All I know is that it's animated, it's popular, and that's good enough for me. Before the video starts, if you're new around here and want to see more film analysis, coverage, and reviews, don't forget to click the subscribe button, like the video, and turn on push notifications. With that being said, I'm going to be starting the show now. I'll see you on the other side. I have many questions. Alright, so I just finished all 8 episodes of the Amazing Digital Circus. And for starters, I need to just mention that this series was nothing like what I expected going in. I mean, where do I even begin in my review? I'm almost overwhelmed in a sense. What I can say about the Amazing Digital Circus, for better or for worse, is that it's ambitious. I have not witnessed something of the sheer scope and caliber in the independent animation space quite literally ever. And so I ultimately find myself enamored by so much what the series as a whole is attempting to accomplish. Granted, as we'll shortly get into, this doesn't excuse the multitude of problems that the show carries throughout the majority of its run, as although I appreciate its passion, I also found its ideas surprisingly more compelling than their execution. For starters, I do have to mention that I was invested inside of the premise right from the start, and really appreciated the artistic flourishes that were instilled in making sure audiences feel that disorientation from the get-go. We as audiences are introduced to Pomni, a human who is transported to a virtual reality simulation that is presided over by 6 other characters. We meet so many characters in that first episode who all have their own intricacies. We meet Jax, who is dripping full of sarcasm. We have Ragatha, the character who I actually thought I had a pulse on as being a secret villain of sorts throughout the progression of its runtime. We have Gangle, a character I ultimately feel sorry for within the context of the story. We have Kinger, a character who is mysterious and definitely hides more than he knows. And of course, Kane, the AI inhabitant who resides over the world and what happens inside of it. At first glance, I wasn't really sure of what was happening inside the confines of the show. Granted, I appreciated how disoriented I was entering this setting as an audience member, but the show itself really doesn't do anything to advance answers or understanding as to the setting itself, and instead opens up more questions throughout its progression than it does answers. And ultimately, although I respect it and love certain elements, I do have to say that I left the show indifferent towards its material overall and what it presents. However, as with all my coverage on here, I will at least make an attempt to mention the elements that do deserve recognition within the context of the show. First, I have to mention the animation style. At first, I felt as if the specific art style used within the show was uncanny and discordant, as if contributing to the surreal style of the show overall in terms of immersion and execution. However, due to the large gap between episode releases, I did see a noticeable increase in quality throughout the progression of the show, which clearly shows understanding and intent as to the purpose of the media medium in general. And ultimately, the voice acting here is clearly full of a cast who care about their art form wholeheartedly and give these characters 110% in everything they do, which contributes to a sense of grounded realism when taking these characters at face value. And as mentioned, this is an entirely individual and singular project, of which I have viewed very little else in the media landscape that could even ascertain an attempt at a comparison to this. On this level, the sheer creativity and originality that was placed inside the confines of this show is something worthy of recognition, and as such, it's something I just respected overall about this show. It's just, the other elements here are not that great, and when taking the show in terms of overall context and value, I just left it feeling indifferent and cold overall. Let's start by breaking down the characterization instilled within the show, as this is a primarily important element used to tell and convey so many of the deeper and more emotionally driven moments within the series. You could say, at face value, that all of these characters have rousing and complex plot lines that at least hint at deeper thematic care underneath the surface. And in practice, this definitely appears to be true. However, as you look deeper beneath the surface here, it becomes clear that this is actually a facade, and that the characterization on display is actually not as complex or nuanced as it appears to be at first, which is kind of a problem when the entire structure of your show relies on this core concept. For example, when viewing the core character of Pomni herself, the newcomer that arrives inside of this brand new world with zero context as to her surroundings, audiences are treated with the core character development of anxiety that hints at nothing motivated to drive her characterization along outside of this. Anxiety is Pomni's entire arc. She breaks down in episode 1 as she tries to escape the reality she finds herself in. As Kaufmo abstracts, this is all she can focus on. While these events are surely affecting in the moment, one could argue that they never actually change Pomni herself. In fact, I found all of these characters here are as frustratingly one note in this regard as you could expect. The obvious exception to this note lies in the form of Kinger, especially later on in the season as his quite affecting backstory takes a focus, which actually fundamentally altered the way I viewed him in the end. At first, I was won over by Jax's sarcasm, as I found it quite endearing and different, but I found the show increasingly relies on this core angle as a substitute for anything meaningful inside of his characterization itself. Take for example the fast food episode or the haunted house episode, where these meaningful changes don't take much of a focus or impact in when internalizing how Jax really feels, or why he uses his sarcasm as a defense mechanism itself. Gango doesn't progress outside of her emotional state in any real fashion, instead internalizing it and using it for many moments that feel manufactured for a reaction from the audience. Even Kane, the rogue artificial intelligence that's supposed to be a force in the show that audiences fear more often than not, is really never taken seriously enough to be a prevalent threat in any single fashion. This considerably lowers the internal stakes of the show overall, and leaves many scratching their heads wondering what the point of his character is overall in the end. And this walks hand in hand with yet another lackluster element in the show itself, which is that there is never a set tone or atmosphere that the series imparts in a particular moment. Instead, the Amazing Digital Circus is an experience I would almost equate to Whiplash, in which you are thrown into the next situation quite violently, as it pinballs back and forth between a variety of different subject matters and genres. And while on the one hand, I respect the show's ambition in this regard by consistently evolving its plot, and never allowing itself to grow stale or stagnant in any fashion, I do feel as if the show never really knew what it wanted to be in any real moment. A serious emotional or psychological moment is an intercut with a joke or humor that feels tonally discordant and off-putting for what the show wants to impart, and never feels crafted in an endearing or caring way. For example, several sequences involving Kinger, a character instilled with his own trauma and grief, are immediately interrupted by jokes that seem to undercut what the show is attempting to do with the character. Another baffling element at play here is that the show consistently leaves audiences in the dark as to whether their current perceptions about the thematic through line are correct or not. Personally, after 8 episodes, I still don't feel the show has given me enough to justify the amount of mystery it still asks me to invest in. That the show consistently keeps you in the dark as to where it's progressing is perhaps one of the most lackluster elements here. Suffice it to say, nothing feels particularly complex or nuanced in terms of the ideas or themes it presents to audiences. This is a show that genuinely breaks down everything to the most simple of structures, never leaving anything to chance, and further adding to the confusion when the series raises so many impactful topics, only to never touch on them again. Another point of contention for myself arose in the form of the Tumblr core-esque dialogue throughout, which was definitely an obstacle I had to overcome within the first portion of the season. As I settled into its groove, I was able to sort of tolerate it to a point, but to say that the show is intrinsically saying anything complex within its runtime is not entirely an accurate statement. So, I've spent the better part of this video so far ragging on what I disliked about the show overall. This begs the question, what were some of the more memorable portions in my opinion? Well, for starters, I found a few of the simplified character dynamics to be quite stirring and rousing in portions. As a protagonist inside of this virtual landscape, Pomni does such a great job at leading audiences along, progressing in terms of her relationships with each individual character as she begins to place herself inside of this viewpoint. As a science fiction nut, I also love the angle with which the series explores the concept of humans trapped inside a virtual reality simulation by a rogue artificial intelligence, no less, as it's such a timely and relevant topic for the space to cover. However, unlike conforming itself to the vast majority of such media that approaches this with a grounded flair and intensity, the Amazing Digital Circus instead broaches the viewpoint through through pure vibrance and creativity. This walks hand in hand with some of the ideas that the show raises later on in the season, such as the arrival of the character of Gummy Goo, who starts to view his environment a little bit differently as he realizes that he is nothing more than an NPC inside of the specific simulation, and begins to rectify his internal viewpoint with what he's perceived around himself. This raises such a timely and impactful theme through which the series explores its core technology dynamic, and you can't help but feel the weight of this moment as it transpires. It's these small glimpses of further thematic material that often hint at something complex underneath the surface here, and this is why I so desperately wish the show is able to explore these ideas in a meaningful enough regard. Unfortunately, it just as effectively pivots away from them before it can broach anything complex or moving in terms of dynamic. Although I can appreciate it on an artistic level, The Amazing Digital Circus is not a show I can say I was ultimately a fan of in the end, and ultimately, that's okay. Walking into this experience, I was looking for something thematically stimulating and rousing, in which independent animation can often broach profound ideas and contemplations within the confines of its packaging. Instead, I got what could best be described as chaos in animated form. And look, one of my main concepts I run my coverage by is broaching understanding into our relationship with media, and how we often carry our own perceptions and ideals on what we consume and appreciate. In this way, I find it ultimately fascinating to hear opinions from people who might like media I dislike, and vice versa. Heading into this experience, even if I didn't end up a fan of the show overall, I wanted to at least have an understanding of why people appreciate and respect the show for a multitude of different reasons, especially as it makes the jump into the cinematic format itself. And having finished the show, did I ultimately find that closure? Yeah, I did. I understand the appreciation many have for what the show accomplishes. In terms of a vibrant, energetic, and humorous romp, the show does such a great job at enthralling audiences from the start and never letting them go. And on this level, I find that if audiences check out the finale in theaters next weekend, they'll be in for a great time that will remind me of the power of the cinematic experience, especially as it continues to branch out into other formats of media entirely. Even though the show didn't quite work for me, I can completely understand why it actually got a theatrical release, which hopefully will serve as definitive proof within the film industry that independent stories are worth telling now more than ever. While I can't say I enjoyed my time visiting the Amazing Digital Circus, I appreciate the experience itself, and that ultimately is the point. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching this review on my channel. If you're new around here and you like the content you see, don't forget to click that subscribe button down below, like the video, and turn on push notifications. Also, leave comment suggestions down below for future video, essay, and review topics. With that being said, until next time, this is Mitchell signing off. Peace out.